Hello and welcome to Live with Jeremy the Ape. It's been a while since I've been on YouTube in any form, let alone a live video, so it's good to be back. We've done a big international move, so we're still getting settled and recreating my whole setup here. So for the first topic, we thought we'd pick something, super straightforward. A couple of real straightforward topics, right? We picked animal rights and antinatalism, so it should be a slam dunk conversation, really straightforward, no controversy whatsoever. So but yeah, I think in the next hour or so, we're just basically going to be defining what antinatalism means, as well as kind of what it doesn't mean, which to me is actually potentially more important. But then also, I'm really interested in the relationship of how antinatalism interacts with the idea of animal rights, and is there a relationship there, both theoretically and practically, if we're on the street discussing either topic with someone, how they could relate and strengthen our animal advocacy effectively. And yeah, just in general, how to navigate these topics. Because I think, regardless of if you're in one community or the other, you've probably seen some heated discussions online about it. So hopefully, in this space, we're able to objectively explore that a little bit together. And just a couple of quick kind of heads up. Just to, knowing the topic, it's inevitable that the idea of ending one's life may come up. So bit of a content warning around that. And then also, we're not here to tell anyone what to think or do. This is really just a here's the topic. And I think for Brad and myself, we've discussed this in the past together. It's certainly not a debate, a mano a mano kind of thing. So it's much more just kind of exploring the topic together, which is really going to be the format of the conversation, but also, kind of kick the tires a little bit and see if this philosophy kind of holds up under scrutiny. If you haven't yet, do say hello in the chat. So hello to Michael, Lawrence, Roger, Deb, Mike as well, Wendy. Great to see you all here. If you do have a moment, it really does help because this is a small channel to give a quick thumbs up. And especially if you know anyone that's interested in either antinatalism or animal rights, if you can drop them the YouTube link to the video, I find that's the most effective way to get it to the people who may want to join us and be part of the conversation, because we'll keep an eye on the comments throughout and try to bring in as many as we can. With that, one thing I like to do with these things is I'm not going to ask Brad his vegan story. I think we've all probably heard these stories before, but what I would like to do is here's the first comment worth bringing up. Roger, aka Ape, and Mr. Snippy. So we'll get to that in a little bit, maybe. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is just to I think in addition to removing oneself from a system is that decision to actually actively campaign against it. So welcome to the show, Brad. Maybe you could just start off and get the conversation flowing with kind of what brought you to animal advocacy and becoming an activist.
Sure. Though first, I do want to say the music for the intro was far too cheerful for this topic. And if anyone is if anyone is here for a cheerful Sunday evening, you want to click X right now, because this is not going to be it. But we'll try and have a laugh about it. How did I get involved in animal activism? So after becoming vegan in early 2016, so I'm still relatively new compared to some, such as in the chat, Roger. Yeah, it was just quite soon realizing that simply not partaking was not enough, and not partaking is the baby step. We kind of talk about baby steps in sort of transitioning to being vegan, but I think that's the kind of the first baby step is before you get involved in activism. But I just saw an ad for the animal rights march in London. This would have been October 2016. I'd never been to any sort of protest before, but the idea of it, regardless of the topic, had always kind of been of some level of interest to me. And I just decided to go along. Didn't know anyone, but we started at Hyde Park and went along, and it was just the most empowering experience, really, and I was hooked from there. So that was kind of my first activist experience for anything, but specifically animal rights.
Oh yeah, those marches are super powerful. I mean, I guess there's lots of discussions about, kind of the effectiveness of one action versus another, but certainly from a community building and just knowing you're not alone. I mean, I think having just moved, I've become more acutely aware of actually how Brighton and London, specifically in the UK activism scene, is very really quite developed. But for a lot of people,
Mm.
they might be the only vegan in the village kind of thing, and to come out and not just stand up on the street yourself, but to be surrounded by like-minded people. Yeah, there's something special about that.
Definitely.
But yeah, I think with that, I mean, we're a few minutes in. We might as well just jump straight into the topic of the day, antinatalism, and really to do that, we're going to do our best to do it justice. But you know, neither of us, I don't think, would identify as experts in the field by any stress. We're not a David Benatar or anything like that. But we are going to open with quite a strong video that I think summarizes these two topics and their relationship to one another, which is just under 2 minutes. And then after that, we'll kind of define it a bit further and get into it. So with that, let's watch the video.
Is it that a relatively large portion of antinatalists is also vegan, and in the vegan community, antinatalism is increasingly discussed. Perhaps because someone who chooses to save a cow from needless suffering may decide to extend the same courtesy to a human, and vice versa. We could say that the common interest is to reduce suffering, but it's more specific than that. If a large portion of society goes vegan, it is neither their aim nor the result that all the superfluous animals will be released and given a good life. Instead, as demand decreases, so must production, meaning fewer animals created. So rather than reducing suffering that exists, both philosophies are about refraining from the creation of new life that will suffer. And both are willing to forego the benefits to avoid the cost. Vegans give up certain foods and products, and antinatalists forego the rewards of procreation. The costs avoided relate first and foremost to existence itself, whether confined to bad conditions by humans or to the human condition. It's easy to imagine an antinatalist going vegan after realizing that a human's existential angst is nothing compared to the horrors of factory farming. The opposite direction, or why a vegan would reach an antinatalist conclusion, is perhaps better exemplified by the idea that the new life we create causes harm, in addition to being harmed. A vegan who speaks of the animal industry's carbon footprint as an argument for veganism may realize that in this regard there's an even stronger case for antinatalism.
So yeah, there is another a minute and a half or so to that video, but to me that is one of the most fantastic, succinct summaries I've seen on the topic. Yeah, it's quite an interesting YouTube channel too, because I think they just do they just make one video a year, and I remember reading in one of the videos, you know, oh wow, you're serious? Because if you look at their history, literally once a year they release just a really powerful, succinct video like that. Yeah, I don't know how we want to crack into this. I mean, I certainly have some thoughts from a language perspective, which I can't help but make. I think the suffering language to me is something that we'll get into later. I do think that lends itself more to utilitarian or kind of consequentialist type idea, which to me moves a bit away from the idea of animal rights. But maybe that's a topic for another day. But I do think it's interesting. I don't know if this jumped out to you, Brad, watching this, but I think it's interesting talking about the idea of vegans or antinatalists giving something up. Because to me, like thinking about like a human injustice, we wouldn't think we're giving something up to basically just think about another individual's considerations. You know, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about sexual assault, for instance, we're not giving anything up. We're just respecting them as an individual. So I thought that was an interesting thing that jumped out. But those are kind of taking us off piece from the main topic. So I think, I mean, maybe do you want to kind of just frame antinatalism how you would explain it to someone who is brand new to the topic, and we can go from there?
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned earlier, it's a good idea to pair that with what it's not, because there's, much like veganism and animal rights, there's a lot of either be it misunderstandings or misinterpretations, and you know, as you've already mentioned, it is quite a controversial topic. I mean, so the Wikipedia definition of antinatalism is a philosophical position that assigns a negative value to birth. I would tend to say it's a philosophical position or stance that opposes procreation, Typically, it is only, I think it tends to be at least focused on humans, but I see it as all kind of sentient beings, all species. That's essentially what it is. But what it's not is any sort of dislike or contempt for humans, especially children. Just because someone doesn't want to have children for these kind of reasons doesn't mean they actively dislike children themselves. And that's quite a common sort of knee-jerk reaction people have. It's also not necessarily a symptom of depression. And again, this is perhaps an early kind of parallel between antinatalism and animal rights. I don't know about you, Jeremy, or anyone else, but I've had a few times people think, you're just depressed when you're kind of thinking about the situation with other animals. But I think it's more
down,
right.
That kind of thing.
But I think for vegans, it's not, being vegan isn't a symptom of depression. If they are feeling that way, it's because we are aware of, what's going on. That's what's come first. Roger says, I like children. I can't bear them, but I like them. Okay.
Can't bear them in multiple ways.
Yeah. The other thing I'm always keen to stress antinatalism, that what it's not is that it's not pro, and again, get into the content warnings, it's not pro-suicide. It's not an encouragement of, ending one's life. Because essentially antinatalism says that before you're born, so let's say you're unborn, you've nothing to gain by coming into existence, but there's also nothing to lose. Once you are in existence, we generally have an interest in continuing to exist. And if we are to, end our own lives, we've lost something there. So antinatalism, and I think they call it pro-mortalism. Very, very different kind of stances.
I like the analogy with that one, to put it a bit crudely though, but if you arrived at a party and you didn't necessarily like the party, the decision to leave the party is different than to not go to the party in the first place, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you might ride out the party, even in the strictest antinatalist perspective, where, there's no such thing as happiness, inevitable harm and suffering as an individual. I think there's still, plus there's the issue of consent too. We can consent to continue our lives, which is different, I guess, from the creation side of things. Do you think it would now be a good time to bring up the asymmetry?
Yeah, we can pop that up on the screen.
Because I guess to me there's kind of two main ways. I'm back in the U.S. now, so I can get away with doing this now. But since I'm talking to someone in the U.K., I'll try to remember to flip this around, so I don't send the wrong message here. But there's two kind of main things, I guess. There's the asymmetry, which we'll get into here in a moment, the details behind that. But I think that the second thing that I think can at least open someone up to the idea of seeing the usefulness of the idea of antinatalism, I guess, as an individual, is really just the moral question surrounding creating a life, which is something it'll be interesting to see what people think in the chat, because I know for me, my experience, most people, when they choose to have children, it's not necessarily thinking, oh, this will be the experience that the unborn children would have. It's more so, what is my experience going to be if I have a kid, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I think that to me is the more compelling point between the two. But I think we wouldn't be doing the topic justice if we didn't first cover the negative asymmetry, as David Benatar calls it.
Though maybe just quickly before this, I should say that generally there's kind of two strands to antinatalist arguments. There's the more kind of environmental or perhaps misanthropic arguments, and these are concerned with the harms that your potential child would do to others and to the environment. The other strand, which I think is the kind of stronger argument, is what you could call the philanthropic argument, and this is concerned with the harms that will befall your potential child themselves. And this is what the asymmetry is kind of referencing. It's that line of argumentation.
I think because that's definitely, because I know I've fairly new to the topic myself, but the philanthropic side of things, I think I think it's natural, like you said, a bit of a instinctual response to think that, antinatalists, don't appreciate life. And to me, it's actually the opposite. It's actually appreciating life so much that we're willing to weigh up these concerns and really how, an unborn would experience life. I mean, how many people ask those types of questions, which to me is what makes it such a fascinating topic. But I think when it comes to the asymmetry, I mean, I can try to run through it real quickly here. So basically, on the left, you have when someone does exist, you've got the presence of pain, put crudely, bad, and then presence of pleasure, good. And then scenario B, you have someone who's never existed, absence of pain, good, and then absence of pleasure, not bad. And this is really the key part where Benatar's position is that it's really that good and not bad offsetting each other, not offsetting each other, that leads to, in Benatar's position, to all life, leading to basically playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun, I believe is one of the comparisons he uses. Which, I'll be honest, I don't know how you feel about this one yourself, but I struggle to get my head around this one.
It is, yeah. I mean, I've read his book. I've watched, umpteen of his podcasts, and even though like there it's reduced to like a really simple equation, and obviously kind of massively oversimplified, you could say. But how I kind of wrap my head around it and how I kind of see it is, I've actually got a couple of analogies to do with this asymmetry, and one of them is from David Benatar himself. So if we think about another planet, let's pick Mars, and let's assume on Mars there's no life. We don't necessarily know it for sure, but let's just assume that is the case. For me, I could look at Mars and say it's a good thing that there are no wars on Mars. There's no poverty, there's no discrimination, there's no terrorism. None of the ills that we experience on Earth, or we have here, exist on Mars. And even though no one's necessarily benefiting from that, I think that's a good thing. I think that's an advantage that Mars has over Earth. But as for the absence of pleasure, which there also is on Mars, that's assuming there's no one there, I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing that there's these kind of absent alien pleasures floated around. God, this is very abstract, isn't it? That's kind of one way that I sometimes think about it. And the other is maybe a little bit more controversial. This is to do with the situation where we have someone who's pregnant, and through some scan, it's been revealed that the fetus in the womb, if they were to be born, they would have a kind of really poor quality of life due to all manner of ailments that they would be born with. And so if we were to prevent that being from coming into existence and living a really short, kind of painful life, I think we would say that's a good thing, that we avoided that harm. We avoided that sort of negative experience for this individual, even though they weren't yet born. So that ties into the kind of I'm getting a bit twisted over here.
Oh, it's such an abstract topic.
Yeah.
Really, when even just engaging with a little bit. I mean, if you enjoy kind of the mental grappling matches with yourself, I highly encourage exploring the topic further, because I know it's really tested the limits of what my comprehension is. Because it also, I think the key thing, which I think you already kind of gestured at, but I mean, antinatalism is compatible with a lot of different philosophies. I mean, you can be religious, non-religious, you can be a utilitarian or deontologist and focus more on the rights of the individual. But it's like even just to try to make a claim ourselves that we have a net negative or net positive life, I don't even know how to go about that calculus.
We don't have the tools to measure that. Unfortunately, we kind of have to go off self-reporting and observations, which are quite subjective.
Oh, and I think Benatar talks a lot about the optimism bias. I think there's also the risk of the pessimism bias. I think that to objectively evaluate one's own life is an incredibly complex thing to do, let alone to do it for the whole, like you said, a whole planet of individuals. I do think that to bring it back to animal rights, I think the thing that has really strengthened my animal advocacy is something that, if you've seen my other videos and know my kind of advocacy work, something I keep banging on about is the lack of focus on the breeding, forcing individuals to have children for specifically animal use. That I think is really absent in the current movement. And that's where I think understanding, or at least engaging with the topic of antinatalism, can significantly strengthen our animal advocacy, because most people, when they first come to talk about animal rights, before they've gone down, studied it in depth, I think the instinct is to talk about the right to life, which to me is completely the other side of the argument, at least I'm trying to present, that actually they should have a right not to exist in the first place. And that's where some of the Benatar positions and stuff, I think, can really, really be helpful.
So I want to pick up on Wendy's comment.
Yes, definitely.
So for me personally, I can't bring myself to say, I wish I'd never been born. I can't bring myself to say that, and I wouldn't really want to, even if I did feel that way, because I can't imagine how my parents would feel if they heard that, frankly. But obviously, when we have a child, a biological child, we take that risk, and we can never guarantee that they might grow up to feel this way. And that is just such a burden to place on someone.
It's kind of like retrospective consent, isn't it? And I think we're kind of, that lends itself to that optimism bias I was just talking about. It's natural to say, oh, I'm already here, let's make the most of it, which I think is, don't get me wrong, that's a reasonable position. But I do think that lends itself to saying, oh yeah, I definitely have a net positive life, when actually it's a difficult thing to evaluate. I think the case for our fellow animals to make is much easier than as from a human perspective, because I don't know, to tie it back to the video, there's a continuum with kind of antinatalism, and then or veganism, and I think antinatalism after that. Whereas I think we've talked about this in the past. I see that happening in reverse. I think it's much more likely that we'll focus on humans before our fellow animals, if that makes sense. And that's where I think this topic is really helpful for strengthening that animal advocacy side of things. But it is an incredibly complex question. If I, could push a button and had to have never existed, I don't know. It's certainly a big enough question that requires more than a short answer.
I think, to add to so Wendy's question, for me, I can't bring myself to say it, but I think it would be preferable that I hadn't been born. And that's simply because, if I wasn't born, I wouldn't know about it, and I wouldn't be missing out on anything. But I would have been spared a great deal of negative experiences, and I would be spared, ultimately death, which is going to reach us all one day.
Well, it's such an awkward choreography, isn't it? Because, like, animal rights, for instance, like, one of the biggest things, and I know I do this in my advocacy, is celebrate, like, look at these individuals, they're just amazing. But then to follow that up with, they should never have existed. It is, it does make sense, but it takes a significant amount of engagements and openness, I think, to come to that conclusion. Yeah, I think maybe if we go through some of these comments, I think that'll be, and then we can kind of keep an eye on the topic itself to make sure because we kind of had a rough running list, but it is a mammoth, nothing against mammoth, but it's a big topic to cover in a live stream. But to talk about the asymmetry is, could click our finger and 100 people are created. And then Lawrence goes on to say, and 90 of them have great lives, but 10 have awful lives. I think most people would say we shouldn't click our fingers. So that's a tricky one I might be pondering as I fall asleep tonight, but it is kind of lending itself more to that kind of utilitarian calculus in a way, at least from my perspective, even though I would identify more of a individual deontological perspective. I just don't know how we'd ever say, like, how do we know 90 had great and 10 have awful? I appreciate it's a bit of a thought experiment, but I don't know how I would even make that claim for my own life, let alone somebody else's. And that's where I'm kind of at the stage personally, which maybe we can talk about our own individual decisions here, but I'm comfortable removing myself from the idea of creating a human, but I'm not necessarily at the point where I would actively advocate against it.
Okay.
So I guess from your perspective, Brad, if I can lighten the mood a little bit, you got your nickname called up pretty early there by Wendy. I understand that recently you had a little bit of a operation.
Wow. Wow. Has that just been waiting there on the side? Trust the
So
production
maybe I
levels.
think because I think we can get pretty in depth with the theory pretty quickly, but maybe if you could walk us a bit through your kind of thought process to decide to get a vasectomy, because I've had one myself as well, full cards on the table, but I think for maybe different reasons to yourself. But maybe if you could just walk us through your thought process, and that might help others to kind of understand the topic a bit further.
Sure, yeah. So I had a vasectomy about a month ago. And for reference, if it's relevant, I'm 26 years old, which some might consider quite young to make that sort of decision. Um, I strongly considered the idea for a few years now, actually, but it took me a while to look into it because I just assumed that, given my age and not having had kids already, I would be rejected on application. But a friend of mine who's actually in the chat, Lawrence, who also, I hope he won't mind me saying, has had one done at a similar age. Yeah, once I learned that he'd done one, and another friend of mine, I thought, oh, well, it can't be that difficult then. So yeah, applied, and essentially from application to date of operation, it was maybe 3 months. So that's all done now. But essentially, the reason I decided to is, through this kind of philosophical position I now have, I couldn't live with myself if I brought someone into this world, to be honest. And this is true especially because of the climate crisis, we find ourselves in. Even if the environment situation was fine, I would still have the beliefs that I do, and I recognize that's a little bit more controversial. But I think it was just reading I've got it up here actually. There's an institution in London called Chatham House. They make like something to do with policies in regards to sustainability and things like this. And not too long ago, I was just reading their summary of what we can expect in the next sort of 20, 30, 40 years. And I can't fathom how someone could read these things and think that having a biological child is a good idea. It's not something I wanted to condemn anyone to. And even though I've never wanted kids, if I did change my mind, I could just adopt instead, which I think is the more kind of ethical way to go about it. And I guess that's a parallel with veganism as well, in that, if we would like a companion animal, we would adopt them. We wouldn't purchase them. And I think purchasing a dog, for example, is kind of the moral equivalent of procreating ourselves, in a sense. Not exactly, but
The whole idea of buying someone is really, I always struggle to get my head around that one, which I think from
yeah,
an
and obviously
anti-speciesist perspective we should, yeah.
that's obviously not the case with procreation. We're not buying them, but I just think if we have this desire to have a family, and there are probably millions of children that need a home right now, that should be the avenue we go down. It shouldn't be bringing someone else into this world. So there's always that option.
Yeah, and I think Mike, great to see you here, is making a great clarification here, is distinguishing between never being born does not equate to wishing one was dead. I do think that's a common theme to push throughout, because
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's oftentimes misconstrued is the whole idea of forced sterilization, which is in my study of the subject, I've yet to come across someone who's antinatalist that supports such an idea. To me, it's, I know Benatar himself rejects the idea of any type of forced mandates, maybe incentives, but always the choice rests with the individual of whether or not to have children.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I couldn't see any sort of strong law put in place to prevent procreation going down well, I think that's just going to end in all sorts of unpleasantness, and that does remove, a sense of bodily autonomy, which, you could say was a rights violation. So
Yeah, and this is an interesting one for Monday. I'm gonna have to think about this one later as well. I love streams like this because they're just so get my gears going too. But some of my most difficult and adverse moments have led to amazing personal growth and lessons. So I don't know that I'd even choose to eliminate them from my life. That's a tricky one. That's one I grapple with because it's kind of that cliche, all things happen for a reason kind of thing. And I've struggled to accept that one personally, just given my own personal experiences in life. But I think that's such a fantastic position to be in. I don't know, how would you feel about that one?
So it's a great point. What I would say is, I think if we make this point in an attempt to sort of reject the idea of antinatalism, I think we're making a mistake, because Wendy's comment, I agree with it, but it's made from the perspective of someone who's already here. If we were to apply that point for someone who is, let's say, unborn, I think it would be odd to say we should bring someone into existence so that they can suffer and then they'll develop some sort of positive aspect from that suffering, when they could have just been spared that negative experience in the first place. So yeah, whilst we're here, if we have kind of negative experiences and we grow from them, great. That's an ideal way to kind of deal with the negative experiences we face throughout our lives. But the unborn, again, let's say, they have no interest in growing from these experiences. So I don't think it's a tricky one to kind of bear in mind, but there is a difference between the perspective of someone who's already here and what we at least imagine would be the perspective of the unborn.
I think just looking through the comments, I think Roger might have missed the mark, and instead of being a sociologist, should have been a philosopher. Because look at this, no pain, no gain. That pretty much sums it up, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you're familiar yourself. I'll confess, I'm not familiar with it by this name, at least. The no subject argument, and that basically that people who don't exist aren't subjects, and therefore aren't missing out and can't be benefited. I mean, to me, that kind of touches on the asymmetry side of things, that it's not necessarily a bad thing for someone to not exist and get those positive experiences. Have you covered that in your study of the subject, the no subject argument?
So I don't think I've heard of the no subject argument phrased like that. That being the people who don't exist. Well, if I'm understanding correctly, that is essentially the aspect of the asymmetry that says it's not a bad thing for there to be a lack of pleasure, because before we're born, we're not missing out on that pleasure. We're not being deprived of it because we don't exist. If I'm understanding correctly, that's kind of a crucial aspect of the Benatar's asymmetry. Maybe I'm getting that wrong, but
it ties in with the whole concept of the afterlife too, because if things are crap here while we're on Earth, to put it crudely, and then in the afterlife we experience this bliss that we may never experience otherwise, then all of a sudden it's there's so many different ways to look at
maybe we'll do a live stream when we get there, and then we can reassess.
Debrief a bit more. So was it net positive or net negative? Let's really talk about this. So Nella's just saying, what about positive experiences? And what about all these people who fight to make the world a better place? What if they had never been born? Because I think that's a common counter, especially within the animal or vegan community, is that by choosing to have children, that they can then carry on and keep campaigning for the idea of animal rights. I know you've got some thoughts around that one. I don't know if you want to have a quick go at that one. I guess the short answer is, why is it the unborn's responsibility to shoulder that burden? Is
right.
A tricky way to look at it.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing, again, like positive experiences, again, whilst we're here, the more positive experiences we can get, the better, of course. I just don't think that the unborn are necessarily missing out on anything by not experiencing these positive experiences, whilst again still seeing it as a good thing that they are being spared the negative experiences. We were intending to mention, what about the idea of having vegan kids to help, make the world a better place? With things like that, I think, first of all, we are making an assumption that our children are going to grow up to be like us. I think it's often the case that we're nothing like our parents, really. So there is that kind of assumption to get over. But like you kind of referred to, I don't think... I'll keep using the word the unborn to kind of represent those lot, banging at the door, waiting to be born. They don't have an interest in making the world a better place. And I think if we're just advocating procreation to kind of bolster this army of people that are going to, improve the state of the world, I see that as a form of using someone else as a means to our own ends. And for me, rejecting that idea is a core tenet of animal rights. Regardless of whether we benefit from it, I think we'll kind of collectively agree that it doesn't matter if we benefit from animal use, it's still wrong because they have inherent rights to be respected. Someone might enjoy the taste of their flesh, but that enjoyment doesn't justify killing them, essentially. And whilst that's, this is obviously a bit more violent, a bit more visceral than procreation, but I do see parallels between the two. And I don't think we're justified in creating a life just for a reason that is at least perceived to benefit us or society in general. I still see that as a form of using someone else. And we can get into the kind of consent idea. That's like a fairly popular argument that antinatalists use, that, no one consents to being born. And it is true. That is true. No one's ever asked to be born. I don't know if I think that's the strongest argument, because there's literally no way to gauge consent. And some people might say, if there's no way to gauge consent, that we are on the side of caution and not bring them into this world. But
that's certainly a compelling point for me, I think.
Okay.
But, I mean, to me, that's a key distinction, though, you just made between animal rights and utilitarianism, which are two very different topics, even though utilitarianism is the dominant, and this whole idea of suffering reduction is the dominant idea in the animal movement at the moment. However, that is a key distinction, that not using others and not even taking any potential benefits into consideration. It's the individual and their interests, and it stops there. There's no calculus needed, kind of thing. But yeah, Deb mentions an interesting book here. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. I think this might be before our time, but in the 70s, a zero population growth book actually motivated many to not have children. So I'm gonna have to look that one up after the fact.
Yeah, no, I've not heard of that. I'd also be curious because it seems to be the case that David Benatar, we keep mentioning him. We maybe should have kind of said a bit more about who he is. He's essentially a professor at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, I believe. And he's wrote a number of books on the topic of antinatalism, and he perhaps coined the term, though I don't think there's kind of confirmation of that. But I'd be interested in this book, or around those times, I'd be interested to hear if antinatalism was a familiar word, or if there was another phrase to describe this belief, this position. That'd be interesting to hear.
Yeah, and welcome, Laura, looks like has just joined us. And Mike has a interesting language point. I love, regardless of the topic, I love thinking about the language. This is an interesting juxtaposition between those that don't exist versus the unborn. And that unborn might be interpreted in a certain way, that they're basically ready to be born, but just not yet.
Okay.
That's an interesting, I hadn't thought about that previous to this myself.
I hadn't. I guess I think it's a fair point. Only thing I would say is those that don't exist could also include those that have died, whereas we're specifically talking about those who are yet to exist. Yeah, so I'm sure we can find
those who are yet to exist might be the next
yeah,
link of the language
gets
chain we
bit,
pull on.
doesn't really roll off the tongue, but yeah, there's certainly kind of language improvements to be made either way when discussing these ideas.
Because Lawrence mentions a prison analogy around Benatar. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it yourself. I'm not myself off the top of my head, even if I've heard it, but around the potential gains that can come from suffering. I imagine it's something along. Well, I won't make a guess. I guess maybe if Lawrence wants to clarify more, if you're not familiar with the specific analogy is, but it is interesting because there is this. I think we're all subject to this optimism bias that says, we're here, let's make the most of it, and sure, definitely, obviously, have a net positive life, but it's really difficult to say that. Well, and Wendy, to your point, does this philosophy extend to free living animals?
We're going to get into wild animal suffering, aren't we?
I was before I started that sentence, I'm like, oh, do we want to open up this next can of worms to liberate? Because that is a huge topic, isn't it? It's at least within the vegan community, it's a fairly new topic around, wild animal suffering, which like Wendy say, free living individuals. And move away from the suffering thing myself, language-wise. But it is an interesting question. At what point, should we, move outside of our impact on the world and look at others? And to me, I think it's getting a bit ahead of ourselves. I think the biggest way we can have impact is animal use, the anthropocentric or anthropogenic animal use that humans create. And then, once we get to a vegan world, I'm happy to have these discussions. But my personal take is it's a bit of a distraction until we hit critical mass and really start moving the needle on animal use and the moral atrocities around that.
Yeah, it's not something I've given a great deal of thought. But I don't think it's something that we should just kind of dismiss entirely. I think there is space for conversations about it. And I think there's a couple of non-profits set up with this as their focus. I think there's one called the Wild Animal Initiative. It's an interesting one to think about, and hopefully we will get to a point where it's a real consideration, a real focus. But like you say, I think there's more urgency on human-induced animal use than yeah.
And very much like the philosophy of utilitarianism, which I understand its merits, but I do have a pretty strong reaction to. I just think the whole idea of going out into and interacting with free living individuals and any type of thing to control them, I just think lends itself to human ego and hubris far too quickly. We can fix the situation when we often make things worse. I got a chuckle at Wendy's The Unborn. Sounds like the title of a horror film. But this is an interesting language suggestion as well, is how about the unconceived? Because that is nice and succinct and kind of says what we want. So we'll let people bang it out in the chat and see what the language.
We'll have to write all the options down and do a poll at the end.
I do love.
You do love a poll, don't you?
I mean, I think because another misconception is around misanthropy, and similar to animal use, it's probably difficult to engage with these subjects without feeling a magnetic draw towards a dislike of humanity and what we do to this world and who's in it and who we share it with. But around Mike's comments around a beneficial child, they would experience and cause harm throughout their life that never needed to happen. So
that seems to me the kind of misanthropic or environmental arguments. I think it's probably a good time to mention, as we did in the chat the other day, there seems to be a critique of antinatalism that suggests that it might be considered racist. And my understanding is that this comes from the idea that all humans are kind of terrible for the environment is not necessarily, it's not that black and white. Because, for example, generally people living in, let's say, the global south, I think is the more PC term these days. Not PC, more, their carbon footprint, their impact on the environment is dramatically less than someone living in the west or the global north. So I think the critique is that to lump all humans as, horrendous for the environment isn't necessarily fair or accurate. And that's something I try to be aware of. If I do make a environmental argument in favor of not procreating, I tend to specify that mostly applies to developed countries. But yeah, that's just something that came up the other day, and I thought we might want to drop in.
Definitely. Oh, and I think a key thing with any complex topic, and I think both animal rights and antinatalism would certainly fit that criteria, separating the critiques between does it justify wholesale rejection of the idea, or is it really just come down to the framing? Because we certainly wouldn't want to send the message that this country specifically needs to be targeted because of their birth rates. I mean, I don't know anyone doing that. Maybe it is a risk.
No.
I don't know. And certainly that, thinking about where these ideas can lead us, I think is really important as well. But looking at the fundamental ideas and then how we can frame it is, to me, a very different thing than actually a wholesale rejection.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think South Park Gaming's point here is, how do we even know that this beneficial, what's the language you landed on? Beneficial, unconceived. How do we actually know that they are actually going to be beneficial? I'd like to think that if I chose to have children, that they would live vegan and, hopefully campaign against it even. But I wouldn't be able to say that with any level of certainty.
No, and I think this comes down to the optimism bias we have, be it about the future, be it about our children. The reality is our children are more likely to get cancer than they are to cure it. And I think that's a kind of dark illustration of the reality of things.
Yeah, and I think to Deb's point, I think this is to me one of the more difficult arguments to wrestle with, is this whole idea of creating a life, creating a human. It's usually done from the parents' point of view, not the unconceived their point of view. Which I think another analogy that I saw is super powerful. I think just a comment actually on the video we played earlier. Which, just a quick shout out, there are in the video description, there are a couple links for those who are interested in engaging in this topic further. One's the short video that we played a bit of at the beginning, and one's a much longer one that goes into the topic in depth to engage with it further. But I do think like the analogy of like, if you were to build a robot who could basically experience the same things we could, would you build the robot? That's another interesting way to it's kind of like the Mars analogy, but it's antinatalism loves the idea of analogies, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There's plenty of them kicking about, but here's Lawrence is back with the prison analogy. So if we imprison someone for a crime they didn't commit, and we knowingly do so, but then this person, whilst in prison, actually personally grows from this experience, does that justify the initial imprisonment? So that is a fantastic question, a great way to frame it.
Just quickly on Deb's comment previously, when I did this sort of like Facebook announcement almost of my vasectomy, because I thought everyone announces their pregnancies and marriages. Why can't I announce this?
Balance it out.
Yeah, exactly.
Negative asymmetry in that regard.
Yeah. I kind of made the point that there is no altruistic reason for procreating. It's typically either to satisfy our own desires to be a parent, or because it would be useful to us in some sense. And I think that kind of expands a bit more on what Deb said there.
Yeah, and I'm just catching up on the comments because we've had our little list that we've been working off on the side just to make sure we kind of touch on the main bits. But I honestly, I just love engaging with the comments here and really just seeing what the room thinks on this stuff. So Wendy says in a utopian vegan world, there would be much less suffering. So maybe antinatalism would be less relevant. So this is a question I grappled with myself when I first engaged with the subject, and I guess you kind of talked about it from the climate perspective. But if there were, this utopian world, can you envision, at a world level, or even an individual level? I know, just real quickly, something I grapple with is I'm confident that we can have a net positive moment. I mean, hopefully, I think most of us would agree with that. The other
Moment.
day, a moment, correct.
Okay.
So it's quick story. I mean, I recently was driving back from picking up my sister's feathery survivor of speciesism, a chicken, and she was sitting here next to me in the car in the back seat in a carrier or a cage. And I started to really ask myself, from an anti-speciesist perspective, why are they forced to ride in a cage beyond, maybe some safety stuff we can talk about. But the reason I share this is because I opened the cage and she very, looked around very cautious, but then crawled out on the cage, sat in my lap, fell asleep for an hour. I think I've got some pictures here. So this is Beatrice. Forgive the sidebar, but I think it's worth it. I think, probably help if I shared it first. So this is Beatrice, and she's 3 years old, and she was up getting some hospital treatment. And so this is us sitting in the back seat here. She just came and crawled onto my lap, but she seriously had a hypnotic effect on me. Like I was, you can see her eyes are closed, my eyes are closed, completely hypnotized me. And then when I woke up, we just had really bonded, and I was like, oh, we just bought dog booster seats so our dog friends can see out the back window. And I just started looking out the window and really considering the world through her eyes. And I felt like a kid, honestly. And to me, like, I think we all have moments like this that we can just really point to and say, that was definitely a net positive moment. And I'm just curious where, more from a utilitarian calculus perspective, I guess, but what's the moment that the math starts to be doubted? Can we have a net positive day, a net positive week, a net positive month maybe? I mean, where does it stop? And that's where I struggle.
Yeah, and we kind of mentioned earlier, we can't measure these things. There's no kind of instrument that allows us to measure how good this experience was versus how bad this one was. For me, if we're trying to kind of make a rough judgment about these things, I think we tend to recollect the good times a lot easier than we do the bad times. And if we just think about like our daily frustrations and our daily anxieties and daily deprivations that in the moment we don't necessarily consider too much, but we would still say is a bad thing on some level. For me, they just kind of, and I hate making it like a calculus, but it kind of is. For me, those moments do add up. And then the question is, do the good times that we have outweigh them? In my opinion, it's no. And we can also think about these kind of good times, achievements, achieving goals, things like these. These take a lot of striving to achieve. To quote Benatar, he said, life doesn't serve us pleasures up on a platter. We have to kind of strive for them. And once we reach these pleasant experiences, let's go with, achieving a goal. Eventually that achievement is going to tail off, and then we'll have this new kind of goal to strive for, and we'll reach that one, and it'll satisfy us for a moment, for a certain amount of time, but eventually it will drop off again. I would describe life as a constant effort of striving to avoid unpleasantness. And yeah, just to reinforce, if you're here for a cheery Sunday evening, wrong place.
It really is interesting because it's difficult when engaging with any philosophy, I think, to not let a bit of our view of the world influence, and inform our position on whatever that philosophy or idea is. And I think that's certainly true with antinatalism. It's really forces us to grapple with our own perspective. But yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely kind of an instinct thing to push the negative thoughts to the back of the mind, because if we constantly were thinking about the negative things, I mean, imagine I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy.
Right. It makes sense why we do it.
Cycling. But and then Wendy raises an interesting point here too, that our brains are actually more wired for negative awareness due to our survival. So there is that. I guess it would depend on the context, maybe. I mean, I know certainly speaking for myself, time has a way of me pushing negative experiences less to the front of my consciousness. So there is that. So I do think I'm probably more susceptible to the optimism bias than the pessimism bias, if we were to put it in that crude binary way of thinking.
On Wendy's previous comment about utopian vegan world, I'm sure we are capable of achieving a world where, you know, there's less negative experiences than there are now, and there's more positive ones. But for me, on balance, when we're considering should we bring someone from a state of non-existence, or rather, what was it, unconceived, to living, based on the idea that person is not missing out on anything, and then we're just going to suddenly create them where they are going to experience levels of suffering and they're going to die. For me, it just comes down to the question: why create someone that can suffer? And this is, you know, boosted by the context that if we want to have a family, we can just adopt instead. But when I'm sorry, go on.
I was just going to quickly say, sorry to interrupt you, but so would that apply to any level of suffering? So even if we could have some type of magic calculator that could spit out a net positive life, but there is suffering, you'd say any level of suffering, it's not worth the risk?
I probably would I would probably die on that hill. And say it's not worth it.
Yeah, okay.
Because, you know, even in this perceived utopia, that person's still going to die, and more often than not, death is either a painful experience or it's, you know, a long drawn out process filled with anxiety. But, you know, this is kind of assuming that we could reach a state like that, and I actually think it's more likely we're going to go the other way, frankly. And you've also, whenever we were to achieve this utopia, there's going to be countless generations in between striving to reach that. So we're condemning all of these generations to life in between, and I don't think it's justified.
Yeah, and I think to Nella's point, I mean, I think we kind of touched on this earlier, that minorities are more likely to suffer from policies, because I think the critiques, the two main ones I'm familiar with, are disproportionately targeting certain groups or countries, which I think comes down to our framing, because I agree we shouldn't be doing that. But then secondarily, also holding the other critique to the side for the moment, this goes back to the point of forced sterilization. To me, is not something I'm familiar with any antinatalist advocating for. I mean, I'm sure it happens, but certainly the dominant voices, it's more of a choice than a really hard to bring myself to say that personal choice, because I'm so opposed to it when it comes to animal use. But, you know, from an antinatalist perspective, you know, it is that person's individual choice, not, and it should never be forced on them to not have children. So to me, I think that framing helps a lot with the critiques, because the other critique is around it disproportionately, which is related, is disproportionately targeting women. And I think here we have a good old male-dominated live stream, at least for who's on the panel. But both of us have chosen to have vasectomies. It's a much more simple procedure, and in the circumstances of a monogamous couple, if you are making that decision together, it makes a lot of sense. You could actually say the opposite, that actually men are more disproportionately targeted. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case, but it's more likely, if more people adopt this policy, that more men are getting vasectomies than the other way around. But I fully appreciate the feminist critique to that, and that's not always the case.
Well, I mean, one of the kind of sub reasons I made my decision to get a vasectomy is because for a while, the kind of societal aspect, or societal expectation rather, of women to bear the burden of contraception hasn't really sat well with me. You know, be it pills or I can't think of like all the other methods of contraception that are available to women, but I understand, you know, quite a few of them have side effects at least. So yeah, just on that thread, I thought that was worth bringing up.
Yeah, and it's great to see in the comments. It's a great chat happening on the side here, and I'm just curious. We've got between us about 10 people still here between Brad, myself, and the 7 watching. I'm just curious. At this point, we're about an hour into the discussion. I'm curious if you've already engaged with the subject, and if so, kind of, are you do you kind of, I should probably make this an easier answer to question to answer easily in the chat, but would you be open to the idea, like, do you see the potential usefulness of the idea of antinatalism, or do you think it should be rejected? So maybe yes, possible benefit, or no, should be rejected, and we shouldn't be considering this as a topic. I'd be curious to see what people say around that. But yeah, it looks like Wendy's about to shoot off, so well, thank you for the comments throughout. It's always great to build on the conversation with other people. So here's Mike. Mike's saying yes, it's an idea worth considering, and I think maybe we can spend a bit of time while people are pondering that, and maybe typing their thoughts in the chat, how to engage with this topic. Because to me, I mean, my focus is to use the controversial language. My focus is ending the animal holocaust, and it's not about the anti-natalist side of things. However, I can definitely see it coming up in conversations, especially when it comes to the forcing our fellow animals to have children. So, I mean, that's certainly how I bring it up in my conversation, and talk about our fellow animals having a net negative life, and that's pretty much a given. And unless we go down the animal welfare hole, where, oh, maybe they do have a net positive life, so our fellow, because you hear the same thing, I'm sure you've heard it, that our fellow animals have a net positive life, so they should be created even if they have, quote, one bad day. So that's where I think really tightening up these arguments can really strengthen our animal advocacy. I know that's certainly been my experience. Maybe, do you have experience with bringing kind of arguments that would support antinatalism into your animal advocacy, and it's strengthening your message?
Only really when discussing it with people who are already kind of conscious of these ideas. So, for example, a non-vegan antinatalist. Yeah, I think that if someone is compelled by the view of antinatalism, but doesn't believe that, or doesn't kind of respect the basic rights of animals, there's quite a glaring inconsistency there. So I would find it fairly easy to slot it in conversation there. But if we're talking about the general public, I probably wouldn't combine the two, to be honest. I think that in general, people kind of struggle to comprehend animal rights at a basic level as it is. So if I'd want to kind of further complicate it by adding this in, I don't think so. I don't think that would, unless it's kind of like an academic space, I just think it would. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I think with all these topics, knowing the audience is so important, because we've got our message we want to say, but if the audience isn't, geared up for it, that comes from a language perspective, all these things. And because it's a serious subject. I mean, it takes, I saw in the chat here, Roger Spence sitting on this one. So we'll have to get back to us once a decision's made, maybe. But yeah, it's certainly worthy of consideration, I think. And I do think engaging with the topic it's fascinating, because I've actually had the experience that engaging with antinatalism has actually made me live a richer life. Because I appreciate this could have a negative feedback cycle, and thinking, if at the end of the day you're doing the calculation of if this is a net negative or net positive day, it could be laborious. But it does make me appreciate the moments like that story I shared earlier with Beatrice in the car. I'm like, this is one of those positive moments. I'm not saying it completely offsets the negatives, but it is a positive moment. I'm really going to live in this moment. So I think there's some beautiful things that can actually come from at least engaging with these more complex philosophies, because it's not always done, I think, in a respectful way necessarily, which on any topic, I think, getting into advocacy techniques, it's good to be mindful of how we can deliver the message in a way that's going to be relatively easy to receive, which hopefully you've done a bit of today.
Well, on the topic of kind of like activism or campaigning for antinatalism, we mentioned off air, there's a group called Stop Having Kids. And, the name is kind of says what it is on the tin, or does what it says on the tin. They seem to focus a lot of their messaging on, we should help those that already exist. And that's where we should focus our energy rather than, you could say, adding to the problem by bringing more people here. So I think they do things like, feeding people sleeping out on the streets and these sorts of things. So I think these are quite good initiatives to combine this potentially this controversial philosophical position with kind of tangible goods that people can get involved with and appreciate and go from there. So I think that's, the name is a bit like, right, okay, blimey. But I think they're doing some good work.
Yeah, can't blame them for being confusing about their message. The message is pretty clear. Well, and Mike makes a point here that I think can help clarify our earlier question, is that if we're creating someone who can suffer, that we should at least be morally indifferent. Which I've studied a fair bit of Benatar's work, but I think reading the books would definitely be a good way to engage with the subject, because I think a lot of these things just take a while to get one's head around.
They do, and when we kind of get into the minutiae of all of this, it is quite heavy. But when I first discovered these ideas, it just made complete sense to me. It was like I'd already thought of this, but didn't have a name to put to it. I've never wanted children, and the reasons have kind of added up over time. So initially it was didn't want the responsibility, which some people might say is kind of like a selfish reason. And then it was learning about the environmental impact. I'm not particularly career driven, so whether I'd ever be in a financial position to provide for someone, I think is kind of questionable. And then it was these kind of philanthropic arguments concerned with the potential child themselves. Sealed the deal.
Just a bit of a observation that it's certainly not meant to be a counterpoint to antinatalism, but I do think it's an interesting observation that the people like yourself that are super contemplative and super mindful about these things are probably those who should be having the children first over who isn't contemplating these things. Because what you just said, the questions you just asked, that you talked about asking yourself, how many parents to be ask those same questions. I appreciate it a lot too, don't get me wrong, but it's
well, I think that's one thing that so like Nella's said, she can't say that procreating is inherently wrong, which is fair enough. So her and I disagree on that, and like her kind of stance is the default one, really. But I think that most people can agree, regardless of what we think about antinatalism, that I think most people can agree that potential parents should be thinking a lot more than generally they do about the decision to have children. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say.
Yeah, because it is kind of an interesting thing, with the whole idea of animal rights. It's the most complex topics I find. It's when, put crudely, rights overlap, and so to go beyond one's own decision, you're really talking about the rights of what do we land on? Unconceived, the rights of the unconceived juxtaposed to the rights of someone who's already here and who wants to have children, and it's to make a judgment on that. It's a tricky one, and that's where I think I'm more individually focused on this one versus kind of outwardly campaigning against it. But I think certainly within the vegan community, I think it would be great to have more, should I say, respectful discussions about this, because I've certainly seen some threads that really target and shame the parents to be, and all. I won't say some of the language I've seen used, but it's and I'm sure that happens on both sides of things too. But I think antinatalism has such a bad name that it's just another of the list of the reasons for why in my opinion, the animal movement and so-called community isn't as much of a community as it could be, because we're not kind of seeing where people are coming from on these complex topics.
If you would say it has a bad name?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
clearly, you've been looking at the online forums more than I have.
Well, I think this would be another do a little mini poll in the chat. Do you think so the options we'll do positive or negative. Do you think antinatalists have a positive perception outwardly to others or negative? Do you think most people think of them in a negative light? I think
The
most
question
people
is how people perceive antinatalists.
correct.
Okay.
And yeah, I guess to that point, real quickly, to Lawrence's comment, I would say net positive life is not great, is because when considering creating that person, we'd be appealing to good things they never wanted to justify inflicting the bad things they never wanted. So
Uh,
that's where the idea gets a bit abstract because the idea of an unconceived individual never wanting good things. It's that's where I struggle to wrap my
yeah.
head around that stuff, to be
Perhaps
honest.
it's better to say that there's kind of no interest rather than wanting. Because obviously, someone who doesn't exist can't want or want not. Um, but on the idea of net positive life, I know you're talking about like the really positive moments. For me, sentience, like just sentient existence, is so rife with negative experiences. I don't actually think a net positive life is possible, is achievable. Um, Again, like I can't write that down on a calculator and show you proof. It's my opinion. I could be wrong, but yeah, I just thought I'd kind of drop that in when I see the use of net positive life.
Oh, it's such a tricky one because it's kind of like the is it Francione who says that we're all kind of even those who adhere to rights are kind of forced to become utilitarians in life because you're basically kind of forced to throw darts in the dark of these calculations to have a
Mm,
stance on this issue. And if we choose either way is a choice, right? If we choose to have children or choose not to, absent things beyond our control, that's a choice that we have to make some type of calculus on.
mm,
Yeah, but it looks like we have two votes. Mike and Roger both say that there's negative connotations with antinatalism, which is another common thread. I think maybe this is changing, and I'm certainly not going to say veganism is a scare word or anything like that. But I think generally in society, vegans are negatively perceived, especially if you're looking outside to non-vegans.
mm.
So that's maybe another thing that antinatalists and vegans can connect on because to me that's where the strength also lies. In addition to strengthening our animal advocacy, is also I'm not saying I'm going to target anti-natalist communities or anything, but you're right. I think you said earlier, like there's such a strong case for anti-natalists being vegan, and perhaps the reverse. But I'm more focused
Mm.
on, how is this, low-hanging fruit, as it were, for the animal movement.
Yeah, no. Well, like I said, for me, the idea that we shouldn't bring life into existence in that unconceived individual's interest is completely incoherent to hold that view and then to perpetuate industries that do exactly that, just for different species.
Well, that's just speciesism,
Right.
defined to a T, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, it is. But on
And
the
this is,
just
yep.
quickly on both animal rights activists and or vegans and antinatalists being perceived as negative, do you think that's just because they're two groups that challenge the status quo? So it's kind of to be expected that the general view is a negative one.
It's really difficult to say because I think if we were to poll, do another poll, I think depending on who you ask, it'd probably be for different reasons. But at least my perception is that it's both going against mainstream culture, but also sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes the way the conversation's engaged with. I think
Mm,
sometimes it's very much you da 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 type, which that's a whole nother live stream talking about different
yeah.
advocacy techniques. But I do
Wait,
think I've seen some pretty kind of very direct advocacy online for antinatalism that I could see why, especially when you're talking to people who have children, it's like a bit like, whoa, you know?
yeah, yeah. Well, now you say it, I can think, we can see vegans kind of having a go at non-vegans with the word like carnist being used as a slur.
Yep.
And I think an equivalent that comes to mind for antinatalism would be referring to um, people as breeders in like a negative way.
Great example. Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
Which to me, neither carnist or breeder furthers the conversation. That's not that to me at least. That's not how I would want to
no.
frame the conversation for either topic. Because yeah, our language creates how we view the world, and if someone gets that perception that that's how we view them, um, to me it's maybe we get them thinking. I don't know. Maybe there'll be some future studies about that, but it certainly to me doesn't set us up for a positive exchange.
Mm. Deb's got a
Yeah.
comment about adoption.
Yes. So I think it looks like we're about 75 minutes in, so we can kind of get through these, go through any more comments you want to share with the group. If you get them in there now, we'll go through as many as we can, and then maybe start to wind this to close. But I mean, I think around adoption, I mean, it's when we say children here, we could equally talk about a dog individual or a human individual. Um, if there's already so many here, shouldn't that be the priority before creating new individuals? Because I think very few people have that kind of big picture perspective.
Yeah, we pointed out earlier, I think that's a really obvious parallel between the two ideas, choosing to purchase or procreate over adopting is, in my eyes, problematic in both contexts. So yeah, in my opinion, to answer Deb's question, no, I think if someone wants a child, just adopt. This idea that our human children have to be like a biological match is just an ego trip for me, and
Lends
quite
itself
archaic, frankly.
it lends itself to human supremacy and probably another few forms of supremacy to think like my DNA is so superior that it needs to be out there into the world. When we take a step back and look at these things objectively, it's like, actually, does my DNA need to be out there in the world? It's I'm not trying to say what anybody should think on that topic, but I do think that's a compelling question to ask oneself. But yeah, it seems like Lawrence has noticed a more of a positive trend recently. So maybe that's more. Maybe you're seeing better communities than I am on the topic. Certainly with people that are open to it. I think they're going to be hopefully more positive exchanges if you're already in a community of people thinking about it. Yeah, and I think Mike's point around that it's not just rights or utility. It can be both, and from a rights perspective, the right not to exist. And this is the point I try to hammer home through my own animal advocacy is actually, you know, what about respecting individuals, the unconceived enough not for them to exist and to consider things from their perspective? Because even if we don't have, like you say, a calculator we can pull up here, if we can get especially speciesists or non-vegans thinking, oh, I wonder if our fellow animals do have a net positive or net negative life. If we can get them asking themselves that question, to me, that's a pretty compelling step to then move towards living vegan and respecting them through that.
I know you purport, the right not to be bred for other animals. That is, and that's kind of the equivalent of what Mike said here.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wrestle with that a little bit because we're ascribing rights to someone that doesn't yet exist. And for me, I struggle to get on board with that. And this is why I've referred to procreation as like a quasi rights violation, because for me, the individual doesn't have any rights until they exist in a morally relevant way. But as soon as they do, and we've condemned them to this life, that's the kind of violation in my eyes. Not that they don't have a right not to be bred because they don't exist, but once they do exist, their rights have already been violated. If that makes sense.
Right. So kind of coming to the same conclusion, but just where it's where we're
Yeah.
drawing the line in the framing of rights, because it's almost, I guess, a lengthier way to say it is the unconceived have the potential to have the rights violated versus actually the rights violation happening in that moment. But yeah, I guess with these things, and especially when it comes to language, it's just trying to find the most direct way to communicate our message that still tries to respond to some of these nuances. It's a tricky thing. I think certainly on this topic or any other, animal use in general, there's several examples of that. So this is something recent Michael was just mentioning, that Superhuman Dance and Antinatalists said in a debate with Perspective Philosophy that to be against antinatalism is to be complicit with pedophiles. Wow, I'm not sure I'm prepared to go there.
No, we're trying to wrap it up, so maybe go to the next one.
That's the
I'm not
next,
sure about
that'll be
that.
part two.
Oh, Christ.
Well, I think certainly, I mean, I have a list of 64 objections to veganism on my website and animal rights.
Only
Um,
64?
well, I was just gonna say if you do that whole
You want to
list,
think about this a bit more.
there's I know, right? Um, there's a lot of suffering that went into that spreadsheet. Let me tell
I
you.
bet. Yeah, that was not a net positive experience,
That was
was
a
it?
net negative experience, but it had to be done. But yeah, I think if you went through those, like, I mean, Deb talking here about the natural side of things, so many of these objections to antinatalism, I think, are also going to be objections to respecting our fellow animals through veganism. So I think really putting these ideas next to each other can help us see a topic we may already be quite familiar with, but in a new way.
I think that kind of relates to what Roger's saying here.
Yeah. So that in Roger's experience in Dublin, some of the loudest voices against antinatalism were from people who had recently had children. Some reacted to the position personally as a personal critique. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Which we've certainly tried to do today. We're certainly not trying to say what anybody has done or should do in the future. To me, it's really just a matter of having the conversation, and what people choose to do with that. I think we can really tie ourselves in knots trying to influence somebody else's actions, and because in the end we can't. So I think it's much more constructive to invite them to consider things and then leave it at that, which is, yeah, hopefully we've done. And Roger's just further saying that they reacted as non-vegans do to news about vegan philosophy. A consideration of the position is subsumed under a feeling of being attacked, which that is definitely a topic that could be another live stream, is this whole idea of shame. And is shame a useful thing, or should we really be focused more on guilt versus shame, and that the focus on the actions versus the individual? Because I mentioned the Holocaust language earlier. I think in some ways, like, people might have a very, very visceral reaction to that on a number of different levels. But if that sits with them and they keep wrestling with it, maybe sometimes these more direct approaches, there's a place for them. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of rambling on here. So, so then Nella's responding to your thought here around the unborn or unconceived having rights, and that it's dangerous because all of a sudden then you're talking about the abortion side of things. So maybe, I don't know if that's the angle you're thinking of things from.
It's not, but it's, yeah, I agree. Obviously, antinatalism has, like, your stance on antinatalism might have an impact on your stance on the debate about abortion.
Probably more likely to support it, wouldn't you, if you're
well,
opposed to creation of life?
Benatar has been asked this question, and I agree with what he says on this. He says that it depends when you think. This might add an hour to the bloody thing in the end, but he says it depends when you think someone comes into existence in a morally relevant way, and that would dictate whether you think having an abortion is in the interest of the unconceived, or if it's equivalent to murder, essentially. So it is compatible with both beliefs. It just depends when you think the individual becomes morally relevant. But we'll leave it there.
Yeah, because that throws another spice into the mix. Because the whole advocating for fetus rights, but already born other animals have none. So that's an interesting inconsistency there. Which I think, not just for ourselves, but I think analyzing these positions, we can look at potential inconsistencies that we can shine a light on, and hopefully get people thinking about our fellow animals or the unconceived differently. With that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of antinatalism and a bit of animal rights thrown into the mix. I mean, is there anything else from our list that you wanted to cover before we put a bow on this thing to be on the internet forever?
Having a scan now, and I think we've kind of organically hit the points that we jotted down. So no, I think that was a nice meander around the topic. So I'm happy to call it a day there.
Cool, yeah, and just a quick thank you. I mean, like I said, I've had a couple month break, which I encourage everyone to consider digital detoxes, because I know it's been nice for myself, but I am looking forward to coming back and doing more videos live or pre-prepared. The rest, I've got a lot of content to edit. I'm in Indiana now, so it's going to be a cold winter ahead. So there's going to be some serious videos coming out in the future. So if you haven't subscribed already, I do encourage you to do that. But with that, I mean, I think we've really, it's a complex topic, and we're under 90 minutes. I think we've done a pretty good job. But anyone who's watched it to this point, especially watching it back, do please, especially the 6 who are already here, please, even if it's just a copy paste job from something you've said earlier here, put a comment on the main video itself after it publishes, because the people who are engaging with this video for the first time, who didn't join us live, they'll only see those comments. So, because there's been some great thoughts in the chat. So let's keep the conversation going there, because while we did our best, I'm sure there's other areas to the topic that we haven't necessarily covered. While I come up for a breath. With that, I mean, honestly, thank you. I know I'm super thankful to Brad for coming on and doing this. It's a great forum, I think, to have these chats in a respectful way. I know there's several. I'm going to watch this back, and there's 4 or 5 things that popped in my head that I want to evaluate more myself. And thank you, honestly, everyone, for joining us. And yeah, I guess keep building the respect for our fellow animals and considering these questions about the unconceived. And as you know, my whole thing is, let's keep evolving our language as well to dismantle human superiority. I guess we'll see you next time, whatever that is.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, it'll just take. I'm a bit rusty, so I just got to find the video here. See you next time. To be a guest on my next live stream, email me at veganinteractions@gmail.com or message me on Facebook. We can explore animal advocacy strategies, or I'm happy to respond to questions about veganism too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.